Hi everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now today we're going to talk about something really important for your practice growth aspirations, and this is the psychology of persuasion. We're not talking about Jedi mind tricks, we're not talking about manipulation, but all of us need to persuade people, don't we? We want to persuade our patients to make good choices, persuade our team members to be all rowing in the same direction, and of course persuading just in our family lives as well. And the perfect person to be talking to us about that is my guest, Dr. Gilly Kahn. Now, Gilly is a licensed clinical psychologist in Atlanta. She specializes in ADHD, anxiety, and depression, and we are going to talk about those as well. She holds degrees in psychology and creative writing, an unusual combo. And is currently writing a book on ADHD in females. She's presented nationally. She blogs for a magazine called Attitude, and she enjoys everything related to psychology. All the way from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Gilly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
All right, Gilly, we like to start with the fast five, kind of quicker questions, quicker answers to get to know you more quickly. Question one, where did you grow up?
Oh, yeah, this is like, we're shooting. Okay, we're shooting questions. Okay, so I grew up in Miami, Florida, but my family is pretty diverse. We're from Egypt, Russia, Israel, Chile, all over the place. So I have a nice little melting pot of a family.
There we are. Well done. Well done. Question two, favorite book besides your own?
My favorite book is On Writing by Stephen King. Because he was my favorite author when I was 14, 15, and just getting my feet wet with writing, creative writing. And I loved writing fiction first. And when I started writing my book, someone bought me On Writing, and everything kind of clicked. I remembered why I loved his writing style so much, and I just think it's a very inspirational book.
Good one. Yes, I am aware of that one. Question three, what's one of your superpowers?
One of my superpowers? I'm very blunt, which is like, I guess, superhero superpowers, they are helpful a lot of times, but other times not so helpful. So I think in reality, that's true for me with my bluntness.
Okay, well, there you are. Look, I must admit I'm pretty direct as well, but I try to be kind and direct. Sometimes they can work well together. Question four, Gilly, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
I wish my 20-year-old self knew, this might be kind of sad, but I wish my 20-year-old self knew that not all people mean well.
Okay.
Yeah, that not to be so naive.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. And finally, question five, something you're grateful for.
I'm very grateful for two things, my family, but then also just finding my passion, because I know a lot of people go into a field and they're not necessarily very passionate about what they're doing, and I just love what I do.
Yeah, great, great. Well, I'm sure that one in particular is something that our listeners can identify with. Lots of different healthcare professionals. I guess I've learned through running this podcast and talking to them that they get into the field for lots of different reasons. I had a dentist I spoke to once who told me she was at school in the year 11 or year 12, something like that, right towards the end of high school. She went out to lunch, she came back to her science class, and the teacher had written dentist on the board and then spoke about, it was a pretty good field and you could use your physics and chemistry in there. And she said before that moment, she had literally never considered doing it. And then the teacher wrote it on the board and she's like, oh, okay, that seems like a good idea. My father was a vet, and the truth is until he finished, he finished high school and he was going to be a doctor. And then they came around and they said, oh, we've got scholarships and you can go and be a vet. And he went, oh, okay, I'll be a vet. So yes, it's funny how people can get into their field. All right, well, we're talking today, among other things, about the psychology of persuasion. Gilly, what's persuasion?
Persuasion is basically getting or being able to have other people see your perspective, or not manipulate, but being able to shape other people's perspectives and kind of do what you want them to do.
Okay, all right. And it's fair to say for our listeners that in business, being able to persuade people is super important. So that which begs our topic for today is the psychology of persuasion. Then what needs to happen for us to be more persuasive?
This is all within kind of like the umbrella of social psychology. And but if we're thinking specifically about persuasion, then there are a few different factors that contribute to persuasion. There's the source of the communication, which is the person delivering the information or the one who's doing the persuading. There's the message itself, or the actual content of what the message is, and the characteristics of the audience. So there are people who are listening to the speaker and what are their characteristics. So all of those factors can contribute to whether someone will be persuaded and how successful you will be at persuading them.
All right. So we started with the source of the communication, which is typically going to be the listener of this show, and they're wanting to be more persuasive. Let's start with their team. They're wanting to be more persuasive with their team. What are some of the things they can do?
When we're thinking about the source of the communication, there are a few different factors. For example, it depends how important the subject is. So if the subject is not so important, like if you're trying to persuade someone about which cereal is the best, what matters the most is if the source is likable, attractive, and similar to the recipient. So some of these things sound kind of shallow, but at the end of the day, as a psychologist, the goal is to kind of step back and just see what are the factors, what are the things that are happening here. And, those are just the characteristics of the message that's being delivered, in which there's more persuading happening.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so in other words, for us bosses, us people wanting to build our practices, likability is a really important factor. It makes you more persuasive and dare I say, more enjoyable to work with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So actually, when I spoke about this subject, it was in front of a group of attorneys. My husband's actually an attorney. And one thing I learned growing up with him, because I was really a kid, we started dating, and is, you think about attorneys and you think, oh, they argue or they have to be very tough. But you're not going to listen to someone if you don't like them. And there are a lot of just basic strategies that you can use to get someone to be more open with you and to want to listen to you. So, I think the first strategy is coming across as kind, gentle, non-threatening, not like, you're trying to push something onto the other person, because we start to bring our guard up if we feel like we're going to be manipulated. It's like if you go into a car dealership, that's kind of the classic example, and I can speak from personal experience, where you start to feel guarded when they start using tactics that you can quickly catch on to. But if you're going and you're just seeing a person and they're kind of like humanizing themselves, then you start to feel more comfortable and you're more likely to buy from them.
Okay. How do our listeners humanize themselves?
Okay, so we're thinking about, you have to think about what the context is, right? Like if you're an attorney and you're trying to make a case for your client, you want to make sure that people are looking at your client, that the jury, right, is looking at your client. So it literally is what it sounds like. Like you're making yourself obviously a human. And to be a human, people have to see you. There's even a phenomenon in psychology called the mere exposure effect. And if you're just exposed to the person and, you don't even know them, but you sat next to them, then you're more likely to view them like fondly. For example, there's research where they'll place two people in a waiting room and they're complete strangers. And then they're asked to like complete an essay and they're supposed to proofread someone's essay. So if it happens to be the person who was sitting next to them in the waiting room, they're like very happy to have, that person proofread their essay, or they would be very willing to proofread that person's essay. But if they've never seen each other, then they would be less willing to do that. So it's just exposure to people. There's also, it's an interesting topic if you're thinking about psychology, and you have from different professionals, different opinions about this. But, if you have pictures of your kid in your office, for instance, that's something that I like, and I like, I remember in graduate school when I would sit in my supervisor's office and I would see her kids, it would humanize her and I would like her more. But then, there are professionals who say it's not professional to have pictures of your family, but then also you're coming across as kind of cold. But it depends on the culture.
Okay. Wow. There's a fair bit there. So, in this particular scenario, by and large, the listener is they'll be interacting with team members that they know, although not always very well. It might be someone who's new to the company. So we've spoken about likable, kind, gentle, non-threatening, and which can be tricky in a healthcare environment. It's fair to say some healthcare environments are very hierarchical, and so therefore, I mean, we've had a previous guest on the podcast, Barton Jennings, who is a respiratory physician. So like a doctor and then a specialist degree on top. And I was so shocked the way he was talking about his team being, it's really important to make them feel important and et cetera, because often that is not the vibe in that kind of environment. But we want to be influential, kind, gentle, unthreatening. You said attractive. That's an interesting one. I understand where that comes from. Is that anything that the listeners should actively cultivate?
There's only so much you can control. But, the way you present yourself is important. So if you're selling your business or your company and you're selling yourself, basically, then you want to fit the part. So you want to look at least, clean, professional, and just also like keep in mind, it's research, that typically, and sadly, it's sort of like my lesson learned that you can't be naive, right? When you come across as more attractive, then more people will want to listen to you. But it's not limited there. There are other factors too. Like, for example, if you come across as confident, like, for example, I was going to talk about, so these are more of the unimportant matters, but then on the more important matters, like if, let's say we're choosing a president, if you're coming across as, an authority in the field, even if you are not, and you're very confident and you're speaking about things definitively, regardless of whether it's fact or not, then people are going to want to listen to you more and they're going to want to see you in a leadership position. So you want to use that information ethically, because if you actually are an authority in the field, then yeah, using that information and practicing public speaking and really becoming kind of fluent in whatever message you want to deliver is important. But also be aware of people who might come off like they know things, but they don't.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, that's the source of the communications. I think the next part that you mentioned was the message. What can our listeners do to be more influential in terms of the actual message that they deliver?
Okay, so there's research on emotion kind of being injected into the message, and that's what catches people's attention. And the research is a little bit mixed. So there's some research pointing more in the direction of like logical messages where you're just including more like facts. And then there's research focusing more on the emotional messages that are catering more to fear. Like people are very aware of when there's like looming or potential danger. So if you're kind of tapping into what people are afraid of, then you're more likely to get their attention. But if you are giving that kind of message, you want to make sure that there's some kind of a solution or something they can do to avoid the threat. Like, for example, if you're a dentist, you could talk about how like you could be at risk for this and this dental issue, but if you take care of your dental hygiene in this one particular way, then you can avoid that problem. And then
that's pretty compelling from a healthcare professional. I mean, whatever it is, I'm speaking to my physio or my podiatrist or my doctor or whatever, and they says, look, Angus, if you continue going down this path,
right,
you're at risk of. It's like, okay, you got my attention. Having said that, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry at one point, Gilly, and I heard that the compliance rate for heart medication was about 80%. And I was like, hello, that's a pretty important organ, our heart. And yet just, I mean, pretty serious consequences if our heart's not in good shape. And yet the compliance of taking tablets, for people was actually not super high. I mean, relatively high, but I would have thought it'd be 100%. So there you go. Okay, so I'm just thinking about, we've got someone who's like, Angus, I would really like to be able to influence my team better in terms of things like being a bit flexible around our roster. I'm just picking an example out of the air, but I know sometimes rostering can be a bit of an issue in the office. And yes, of course, everyone would like to work the hours that work perfectly for them, but you've got to work collectively to deliver an outcome. How do our listeners get to be more persuasive? Yes, they can be more likable, and I assume that there's probably a benefit in being a bit more empathetic there too. I must say, just going back, I actually think the photos of family, in your office, I don't think it's a bad thing at all.
no.
As a marketer, I'm in the business of psychology, make no mistake about it. And I deliberately, when I present, I've got a slide that's got a photo of me and my wife and my kids. It's like, hey, this guy is delivering a message, but I'm also a real human.
Exactly. Yeah.
Attractive, like just put our best foot forward, I suppose, in a sense, being presenting professionally and so on. I think the confident part is good, but how do we, we're trying to get this message across. Come on, guys, I really need you to work together. We've got to get we need the ship sailing in the same direction. Let's all work together on rostering. And yet, people have got their individual needs and interests.
When you say rostering, you mean like scheduling?
Yeah.
Like getting people on the schedule?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can still use all of the strategies that we discussed to get people to be, I guess, more flexible and more comfortable with scheduling needs, or with maybe not doing things exactly the way they want them to be individually. So that way people are catering more to the team. And if you want people to like you and to feel closer to the team and more affiliated with the team, you need FaceTime, right? Because they need to see you. You need to be a human to them, meaning holiday parties, like invite them over to your home, or, host something where they see you as a person. But also it's not just about you. It's about also feeling that cohesion. So, scheduling like stuff that involves the team, depending on how big the team is. I think that's really, really important. For example, I have bonded the most with my Pryor, teammates, the most in situations where we went to a conference or we worked together on a team presenting something. So, if there's something you can do to get them to work together toward a common goal, then I think that's a nice way to bond people, to make them feel more committed to the office. The other thing I found is when you start to feel like more at home in the office, then you feel more comfortable and you feel more dedicated to it. Like, for example, my family, I have family like in field of like OBGYN, like basically all my family works in that office. And they kind of work together to decorate the waiting room. And that was a project, that they had. And so they feel this commitment. They're more like happy to be there because they designed it themselves. And so these seem like, I guess, like silly extraneous things, but it's money in the piggy bank because it's an investment down the line.
Yeah. Deposits and withdrawals. Sometimes I know people talk about it's not literal from a bank account, but you could say virtually from a maybe an emotional bank account, a psychological bank account. Now, Gilly, so we've got the source of the communication, we've got the message, and then I know one of the other things you spoke about is the receiver of the communication. What are some tips, I guess, for the listeners in making sure that there's not an obstruction there?
Sure, yeah. And before I go to that, there was one more thing I wanted to add that was kind of an easy hack, just in case our listeners just like they don't know about this. But also think about what the background is when you're delivering a message. Like, for example, right now you're sitting with a lime and a lemon behind you.
Yes, I am.
That's what I'm noticing. I don't know what emotion that's bringing about, but like, the way you design your website, the way what we were talking about before, you design your waiting room, it's all part of, the experience, and it's sending subliminal messages. Like, for example, when I presented to the group of attorneys, this was funny, actually. One of the attorneys, before I even brought this idea up, she said, oh yeah, this one client was very challenging. They just would not accept the suggestion. But then we went out for a drink and it was a completely different story. And, it's not just the alcohol, it's also the setting. It's way more laid back. And so, keep that in mind, like the atmosphere, not only the physical atmosphere, but also like the virtual atmosphere, the office atmosphere. What kind of vibe are you trying to give off? And then in terms of the receiving end, this is actually very, very interesting. Okay, so here, it's funny to talk about these things, it's like you feel half guilty, but then you're like, you know what, I'm just delivering data. Okay, so here are the people who will be easiest to influence. Those with moderate self-esteem. So those who don't feel bad about themselves, don't feel too confident or cocky or full of themselves. They're just kind of like chilling. Those who are vulnerable. So those who really need help, which makes sense, right? If you really need help and you're really struggling with your health, I'm going to listen to you,
Yeah.
those who are very involved with an idea or product. So that's why a lot of times those people are removed from juries because they are too entangled in whatever the issue is. And I think this is probably the most interesting piece, but young adults are more persuadable than older adults. And that kind of makes sense because as you get older, you're kind of more ingrained or more solid with your opinions and your beliefs. And when you're younger, you're a bit more malleable.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I suppose one of the things you're lacking when you're younger is just context. You know, when I look back to some of my work environments and think, oh, why did that happen? And, you know, why didn't I do as well in that space? And it's because in a way, I was in my own little bubble and I didn't really have a sense of the bigger picture. But as I've moved through my career, I've got a much stronger idea about the bigger picture. And so therefore, when something's delivered to me, I'm perhaps able a bit better to make sense of it and go, yeah, I think that's a reasonable request, or no, that feels a bit weird, you know, compared to where we're sitting. So yes, I do remember that quite vividly in my early days in my career. Now, Gilly, I suppose I'm conscious that we're running out of time. I'm just thinking of one of the listeners. They're like, I appreciate all this kind of the psychology, guys, but I've got a conversation that I need to have with a team member and I need to do some persuading. What sort of preparation can they do?
Okay, so here, and this is the most important thing that we're trained in psychology when we are, because I've also worked in primary care settings. It's motivational interviewing. So if you haven't heard of it before, then definitely look it up. But that's basically a set of strategies that are recommended to use, like in the health fields, or if you are generally like working with people and trying to convince them to do something. So for example, if you're a doctor, you're trying to get your patient to stop smoking, telling them, you know, smoking will kill you is not enough. Yes, that will bring about fear and sort of similar to what we were talking about before, but you also need to think about the receiver, right? Like if they are in a different stage of willingness to change, and they're really not even considering it, then you're going to have a much harder time just using facts than if they're teetering and, you know, they've thought about it, you know, they've entertained the idea and they're just not sure. It might be easier, you know, to have it in and convince them. But I think the main takeaway for motivational interviewing is talk less, right? Which is hard because it takes time to be in the office with your patient and, you know, you're back to back, your schedule is full and, you know, the goal is to move on from one patient to the next. But if you are just barking orders, then they're probably not going to listen to you. Or, you know, if they don't follow through, maybe it's time to slow down and just listen to them, listen more. The other thing that I found to be very, very helpful for me also with more like challenging or difficult clients is, and I work with teens too. So I've worked with teens who, you know, use cannabis. And so I've used some of this too in my practice. But it's called a decisional balance. And a decisional balance is basically where you are working with the patient to assess like the pros and cons of continuing with the current behavior versus changing. And what you want to do is start with asking them, why are they doing what they're doing? And then, so for example, if it's smoking, I would say like, well, I'm sure there are reasons that you're smoking. There are some benefits or some things that you're getting out of it. So what are some things that you like about smoking or what's keeping you smoking? And that's helpful for two reasons. One, it shows the patient that you're not there just to change them. You want to hear what their perspective is. And two, you can kind of learn what is the function of that behavior. So any unhelpful behavior that people engage in, usually there's a purpose or like some kind of a reason, and then we can find other healthier ways to fill that void. And so after they're done talking about the pros, you can ask them, okay, now what are some not so good things about smoking? And then you want to spend a lot of time on that and really highlight any change talk. Change talk is basically anytime they kind of recognize, oh, this is a problem. You want to reflect that, like repeat that, or get them to talk more about that. And it helps them realize, kind of the negative things, because when they're just focusing on smoking, then they're not really taking the time to dwell. And they're coming up with the information themselves.
It's funny, Gilly, I'm listening to what you're describing there, which is very helpful for any of conversations where we're trying to influence people and get them to change their behavior. What you are describing, honestly, is a sales process. Like for someone who's going through a sales process, it's exactly the same thing. It's like, tell me where you are now. Where do you want to get to? Like, what's the difference between where you are and what you want to get to? And they start going, oh, well, it's this and it's that. And what happens if you don't make a change, and it's like, oh, and it's exactly what it is. I've heard it said, in fact, I think I coined this phrase, like if you say it, it's debatable. If they say it, it's gospel. And so if you can get them to enunciate whatever it is, I'm always late because of bus schedules or, whatever. Like if you can get them to say that, then it means it's so much easier to have the conversation because you're able to refer back to what they've already said rather than you coming in and kind of slamming the table and saying, hey, this is the way it's going to be. Well, there is a lot there that we've covered today in this short time, Gilly, and hopefully a bunch of tips for the listeners at the same time. Now, you're writing a book, but the truth is at the time of recording, it looks like it's not going to be out for a couple of years yet, so maybe we'll have to get you back on to talk about that. But if people want to get in touch or find out more, what should they do?
You can find more information about me on my website, which is Dr. Gilly Kahn, KAHN. .com. And you can also find me on social media. I'm also working on, I just made an announcement about this. I'm going to start a monthly newsletter or video, something informative as I'm working on my book, which is, the title is Allow Me to Interrupt. And my first draft is due in November to my publisher. So I will definitely keep you updated on my journey.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Gilly. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much, Angus, for having me on your podcast.
All right, everyone. Well, we've covered a lot there, haven't we? And as I ask you every week, it's not knowledge that's power, it's applied knowledge that's power. So what is one thing you can do as a result of what you heard today? Make sure you go and do that before you go on to the next thing. Finally, if you got some value from our time today, we'd really appreciate if you'd leave us a lovely review to give us the encouragement to bring you more great content on Practice Growth HQ.